I love learning about military history, and in today's video, I heard for the first time something so shocking about the United States and Britain that it blew my mind. This whole ally thing that we have going on? Yeah, no. It's not what I thought at all. What is going on? Are you serious right now? Hey everybody, Roger says hey. So this is a Patreon request from Scott on Patreon, of course. And this video is about the War Plan Red. Now the video actually is titled Plan Red, Britain and America's Planned Wars on Each Other. But when I look this up, it says the War Plan Red, also known as the Atlantic Strategic War Plan, was one of the color-coded war plans created by the US Department of War during the interwar period between 1919 and 1939. So between the two world wars, covering scenarios related to hypothetical war with the British Empire. What? I have so many questions about this. First of all, weren't we allies with Britain at this point? Also, was the British Empire still a thing at this point? I mean, I kind of had the feeling that around World War II, maybe it was still a thing, because wasn't it kind of like after World War II where the British Empire kind of like cut back on some of the, you know, colonization stuff? I had the impression that the British Empire kind of like started to slowly dissipate in the early 20th century and wasn't really kind of a thing at this point, but we all know how limited my knowledge of history and all of this is. So again, this might be one of those like mind-blowing videos. Well, it is going to be, because like I don't know why the heck we would be going to war with Britain unless this is like one of those other gotcha videos, like when Britain nukes America and this is just like a war game scenario. Because if this is real, like what the heck? America, like US, like what? Why? I mean, if we were literally planning on going to, I mean, not planning on it, but like drew up plans to go to war with Britain, like legit, then there's a whole heck of a lot about American history that I am just clueless about. Speaking of American history, I'm kind of glad that I'm doing this because I haven't done a whole lot of videos on the United States. Like American history was always my favorite to learn about in school, maybe just because, you know, it's the country that I'm from, the United States. So it's of interest to me in particular. You know, sometimes you get fed the romanticized version of American history in school though, so there's a lot that I'm sure they left out, which means that there's a lot for me to learn. But I have had some of you from over in Europe and UK and stuff say that you're interested in American history too, because you guys don't learn it very much, so you know, it might be beneficial to all of us. Right now we're going to learn about Plan Red because apparently they have several color-coded plans. So this is Plan Red. They have like a Plan Blue and green and yellow and purple and all of that stuff. And if so, what the heck were those plans? Oh my gosh, history is just full of like crazy stuff that you would never have thought of. And the crazy thing is that it's all real too, you know? Alright, anyway, we're going to watch this Plan Red. Part of me is kind of nervous about this because I feel like I'm about to find out something about the United States that I didn't want to. And I might be getting duped too if this is a war game thing. But before we get into that, I just want to say I hope you're enjoying this video, and if you do enjoy my videos, I would appreciate it if you would hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't done that yet. Let's see how the US was planning on defeating Britain here.
The United States and Great Britain were the closest of allies during most of the 20th century. They fought together in two world wars and acted as the cornerstones of the post-war NATO alliance. However, for a time in the 1920s and 30s, things were not so rosy. For a time, the militaries of both nations even prepared for open conflict between them.
So this is no joke. This is not a war game. Are you serious? What happened?
The impact of the First World War had changed relations between Britain and America in some ways that were likely to increase tension between them. First, it left the UK owing a huge war debt to the United States, $22 billion, at a time when their entire GDP was just $26 billion. Secondly, it removed Germany as a global naval power, when its mighty battle fleet was interned at Scapa Flow and then broken up. With the Germans out of the picture, the United States became the world's second naval power behind Britain, which potentially made her Britain's primary rival for control of the sea. This This
Rival?
newfound naval strength was recognised in 1921 when the British agreed to parity with the Americans in capital ships at the Washington Naval Conference. Unlike with Germany's naval challenge earlier in the century, the British government had little desire for another costly naval arms race and was determined to see the United States as a partner, not an enemy. When the Admiralty recommended in June 1919 that an officer be tasked with drawing up contingency plans for war with the US, the British cabinet refused. Prime Minister David Lloyd George was keen not to allow the Navy to use the newly powerful American fleet as justification to increase the size of its own. This decision irritated some within the Navy who thought that war was possible so long as America's commercial influence across the world continued to grow. Deputy Chief...
So why would they assume that we would go to war with Britain over, like, I guess this is one of those things where I have to put myself back in the 1920s and not think of this through 2021 eyes, like we're 100 years on now. It just seems bizarre to me that Britain would view the United States as an enemy in the seas. Like, in my lifetime, we've always worked together with stuff, I think, you know, with that. So this is kind of bizarre to me listening to this. Now, this is, you know, they were actually a little over 100 years after the War of 1812. See, I'm not really familiar with like what happened after that between the US and Britain exactly. Like, I feel like we didn't really do much, you know, but feeling isn't knowing. So it's also really interesting to me that the Brits didn't want to like expand their navy. I feel like that's a very un-British thing that they would do.
So long as America's commercial influence across the world continued to grow. Deputy Chief of the Naval Staff, Vice Admiral Sir Osmond Brock, argued that because of Britain's track record of fighting those who threatened its commercial dominance, I am quite ready to allow that a war with the United States is very improbable, but that it is impossible I cannot allow. As for how such a war would happen, the concern from a British perspective was not that the US might simply wake up one day and declare war on Britain, but that the two nations might accidentally stumble into hostilities in a dispute over trade. For example, suppose that Britain was involved in a war against another nation, which the US traded with. Under what Britain termed its belligerent rights, she would claim the ability to stop and search neutral merchant ships and seize any goods which it was believed was heading for the enemy country. During World War I...
Why is he bringing up France though? Because at this point, wasn't France an ally of Britain too? It's also interesting that we're seeing this from a British perspective too. I actually was going to this expecting to see like the American perspective of it and like why we drew up plans to go to war with Britain, but we're being presented the opposite of that. This is like Britain's concern about going to war with the United States for some reason. I don't like again, this is just like bizarre to me. Like, I feel like the United States wouldn't provoke war against the UK. Like, why would we even want to do that? But okay, I'm gonna back it up here, guys. I have to
into hostilities in a dispute over trade. For example, suppose that Britain was involved in a war against another nation, which the US traded with. Under what Britain termed its belligerent rights, she would claim the ability to stop and search neutral merchant ships and seize any goods which it was believed was heading for the enemy country. During World War I, the exercise of these dubiously legal rights had irritated the USA considerably, and let's suppose that the same was true in this hypothetical war. Only this time, the US, feeling confident with its navy at parity with the UK now, decides to escort its merchant ships to and from Britain's enemy and force its trade through. This would give the British a huge problem, since cutting overseas trade to a hostile nation was extremely important to any war plan it drew up against any major power. If the US took action to undermine this, it's likely the Royal Navy would feel it had no option but to use force to protect its belligerent rights and thus slip into a war against the United States without really meaning to.
Okay, look, I understand. I think he was just using France as an example. Like, I guess France and Britain were allies at this point. He was just using that as an example, maybe like a historical example or something. Hypothetical. Sounds to me like Britain just was getting concerned that they were losing control of the seas and they were no longer going to be like the king of the seas like they had been for a very long time at this point. Which is understandable. Like, if the same thing happened to us now, if China or Russia's navy became on par with ours and started to really become a threat to our Navy, the US would feel the same way. So I get it. But what is bizarre to me is like China and Russia aren't really our allies. I guess again, like I have to put my head in this time period, was Britain actually that concerned about the US? Were they that like suspicious of the US? Like we just fought in a world war together. Also it's like some of this maybe because of the amount of debt that Britain owed the US, like maybe they figured the US would start like asserting some of its power and kind of use that against the UK in a way or something. Again, sorry for like all of the interruptions. I'm just literally just trying to wrap my head around all of this. I had no idea that the two countries felt this way about each other. Like this is really blowing my mind right now.
Rights and thus slip into a war against the United States without really meaning to. This is the scenario which some in the Royal Navy foresaw. Admiral Sir Roger Keyes, commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, told Winston Churchill in 1927, "If we are ever at war with America neutral and the American fleet sets out in convoys to force her trade, I pray that the government of the day will have the nerve to allow the British fleet to deal with the situation." American officers too were not blind to the possibility of a war with Britain, even though they too had no desire for one to take place. One difference between the two nations' attitudes though is that the Americans thought it feasible, perhaps even natural, that Britain would declare war on them to protect her commercial position at the top of the tree. As far as the
What? We thought it was natural that Britain would want to go to war. What?
Though is that the Americans thought it feasible, perhaps even natural, that Britain would declare war on them to protect her commercial position at the top of the tree. As far as the Americans were concerned, argues Christopher Bell, Britain had always used its navy in a ruthless and calculated manner to protect and further its trade, and would continue to do so. Just as the British had attacked Copenhagen in 1807 to protect its trade through the Baltic, it seemed possible that they would do just the same to the US if they got the chance. So, with this in mind, in 1930 the United States Army and Navy devised War Plan Red, a comprehensive plan for a war with Britain and her dominions. The central focus for Plan Red was Canada, which it was thought would be firmly on Britain's side in any conflict. The worst case scenario for the US was considered to be a rapid and massive build-up of troops and ships in Canada through an invasion south. It was forecast that within 40 days of war being declared, Britain could have a fleet of 14 battleships and 5 aircraft carriers established at Halifax. It projected 345,000 troops could be mustered in Canada within 6 months, with reinforcements from across the Empire eventually taking the total up to 2.5 million men.
What is going on? Are you serious right now? The US really thought that Britain would do this? Guys, it might look like I'm overreacting right now, but this is a genuine react. Like, this is genuinely, like, blowing my mind. Like, this seems, like, too bizarre to be real. Like, what the heck? So was Canada that chummy with Britain that they would just, like, Canada was its own country at this point, right? So are they think Canada's just gonna let Britain, like, march their troops in and invade the United States?
Clearly, to allow such a force to assemble would be incredibly dangerous, and so Plan Red recommended attacks into Canada to capture major cities and especially the port of Halifax, to deny the British a suitable naval and supply base on the Atlantic North American coast. Other attacks would capture Quebec, Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg and Vancouver, aiming to overrun Canada in a very short space of time.
What the crap?
Opposing the US drive north would be the small Canadian army of 95,000 men. The US thought these troops would attempt to hold Halifax and a line around Montreal and Quebec, but the only serious Canadian plan produced called for a somewhat different course of action.
This can't be real.
Designed by Lieutenant Colonel James Buster Brown in 1921, Defence Scheme No. 1 advocated a series of rapid attacks into the United States by so-called flying columns. Under Brown's plan, these units would advance to the US on the day war broke out, go as far as they could and then retreat, destroying infrastructure as they went. The purpose of this was to buy time until the British could come across the Atlantic to Canada's aid. However, from what we can tell, the British had no intention of deploying a major force to Canada. In the view of the Admiralty, it would put Britain into a fight where all advantages of time, distance and supply were on the side of the USA. For all intents and purposes, the Royal Navy wrote off the vast majority of Canada as having fallen and began its planning from that assumption. However, it is worth mentioning here that the British never produced
What is the relationship between Britain and Canada in the 1920s? Like, I thought that, did Canada not have independence as its own country at this point? Or are they still, like, firmly under, like, I don't know, British rule does not sound like the right term to use, but for lack of a better term, are they still, like, under the British Empire, Commonwealth? I mean, I know they're part of the Commonwealth now, but guys, this seems like a game. The thought of us invading Canada and taking cities and the Brits going to Canada and like invading the US and attacking cities here, like this seems so bizarre to me right now that like I can't even believe that it's real. Like, I guess it was, but what the?
They joined up into service war plan in the way the US did. So it's hard to say with real certainty what they up in from that assumption.
What?
However, it is worth mentioning here that the British never produced a joined up into service war plan in the way the US did. So it's hard to say with real certainty what the British would or would not have done. Perhaps troops would have been sent across the Atlantic, but even if so, they would have likely found ports to be in American hands. This was because Defence Plan No. 1 put very little emphasis on holding the Atlantic ports, even as it relied upon British troops entering through those very same ports to aid the Canadian Army. Unsurprisingly, almost nobody within the Canadian military thought this was a sensible idea, and Defence Plan No. 1 was very quickly dismissed. Brown's successor as Director of Military Operations and Intelligence...
None of this is a sensible idea. None of it. Not just Defense Plan 1, but the whole freaking thing is not a sensible idea.
The one was very quickly dismissed. Brown's successor as Director of Military Operations and Intelligence, Andrew McNaughton, even ordered all copies of it to be burnt. On land then, it seems pretty likely that the US would have been able to overrun Canada, save perhaps for a few key bases on the east coast.
You think?
How a war would progress from there is unclear, and seems not to have been very clear in the minds of those planning for it. Plan Red essentially hinged on the idea that in the long run America would be able to mobilise its superior resources and, with the occupation of Canada, eventually forced the British to make a favourable peace deal. The British planned to use its navy to just make life unpleasant for the Americans. A strong fleet will be sent across the Atlantic to be based at Bermuda, with smaller fleets in the Caribbean and at Halifax. From this position they would try to keep the American fleet bottled up, unable to attack British shipping while enabling British cruiser forces to hurt the US's overseas trade.
Why would we
Neither
attack
side
British
was
shipping?
keen to seek a major fleet engagement, so the strategy for both would be to try and make the war as unpleasant as possible for the other side, and essentially outlast them. The reality would be that without Canada as an active theatre, neither nation had a very effective way to deal a decisive blow to the other. The only way this might have changed, and this is what the Royal Navy feared more than anything, was if the US was able to gain a naval base in Western Europe and move its battle fleet across the Atlantic first. With a US fleet in place in Europe, the Royal Navy would find itself pinned down, with its trade routes open to being decimated by roving US cruisers. A serious blow to Britain's overseas trade would always be decisive, which is why the Royal Navy was always so anxious to maintain its superiority on the oceans during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Ultimately, we will of course never know the outcome of a war between the United States and British Empire, as thankfully policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic knew just what a self-destructive folly it would have been. Instead, War Plan Red would be far underway, and a decade later Britain and America would find themselves allied once again, joining forces to help rid the world of fascism.
What did I just watch? Okay, yeah, this is definitely something I knew absolutely nothing about. I can't even like put into, I feel like I've already said everything that I can about this. Like, the whole thing is bizarre. It's crazy. I can't believe we had plans to invade Canada and like take their cities. And I guess my big takeaway from this is that I don't understand the mentality and the relationship between Britain and the United States at this time. Obviously, to me, this says that we didn't really become solid allies until after World War II, and it's the World Wars that really solidified that. I really kind of thought that in the 20th century, the US and Britain really saw kind of eye to eye and were allies. I mean, I guess there has to be a trigger for kind of that allied partnership at some point. I guess the World Wars were that trigger. It's also really interesting to me to see how the British lost control, like lost that superiority of the seas as well. I knew that the US had surpassed them at some point, but I have never really seen it kind of play out like this before, and I didn't realize that this is kind of how it happened. I am just now kind of like getting into World War I on my channel. I'm starting that series. We're going to be doing like all the Great War videos on it. So I think some of that is my lack of knowledge with World War I and just kind of like how the US impacted that, even though we weren't part of it for very long. But yeah, I feel like this has opened up an entire can of worms, because now I want to like learn all about the British and American relationship during this time in the early 20th century. If this kind of stuff was going on, like what else was going on? I just still can't even wrap my head around the fact that the Britain thought we would want to interfere with their trade, and that we were, I don't know if we were concerned that Britain would interfere with our, I guess we were concerned that Britain would interfere with our trade as well. Yeah, it just kind of seems like ever since, you know, the 1700s, mid 1700s, I guess, when tensions were really started to kind of heat up between the, well, it wasn't the US at that point, but what would become the US and Britain, that kind of carried on even up to like World War II apparently. Like we were like really skeptical of each other, it seems like. I didn't realize that it went up that late into the 20th century. I really thought that like maybe by the 19th, like the late 19th, mid to late 19th century, we had kind of like gotten past that point with Britain, and we were, like I said, I don't think we had a whole lot of dealings with them in the 19th century other than the War of 1812. I feel like there's like that gap of about 100 years between the War of 1812 and then World War I, where we kind of like dealt with Britain. But again, like that's a lot of history that I don't really know, not very familiar with, so we probably did a lot of stuff with Britain at that time that I don't know about. But yeah, my head is like literally just spinning with this. I feel like I can't even like give a good outro. Alright, Scott, well, I appreciate the suggestion. Definitely learned quite a bit. Is like one of those things where I learned something, but then it just like I have 1,000 other questions now. This is really unbelievable to me, like this whole thing. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure again to like and subscribe. I would appreciate it. I also have links to all of my Discord and Patreon and social media in the pinned comment and the description if you guys are interested in any of that stuff. We'll have more stuff like this coming up on my channel because I love this type of stuff. I absolutely love it. If you guys want to suggest more videos that have to do with stuff like this, maybe help me like learn what the heck was going on between the US and Britain at this time, then make sure you do that down in the comments. I would appreciate it. Roger here, and I thank you guys for watching as always, and we'll see you next time.